Welcome back, everyone. This is DA Sports. I'm your host, DASASIN. Thank you all for tuning in. This is episode number 21. Today's show, we got a few things to get into. I'm going to do a quick recap of a few things from UFC 309. Then we're going to get into my picks and how they did from this past weekend. Then, of course, we got to finish with my top 5 and worst 5 NFL rankings after week number 11. So let's get into it. Okay, so to start, we got to get into UFC 309. Now, for those that missed it, UFC 309 was the UFC fight that happened Saturday night in Madison Square Garden, New York City, New York. Now, it was headlined by the heavyweight title championship belt that was fought between John Bones Jones and Stipe Miocic, two of the greatest fighters to ever fight in the UFC. Stipe is the most accomplished heavyweight fighter in UFC history, and John Jones is the most accomplished UFC fighter, period. And this fight was just another one that he was able to notch in his belt to show just how much he is easily the GOAT of fighting. He's beaten more competitive fighters than anybody else. His reign has lasted longer than anyone else. He's now done it in two very difficult divisions, and nobody can beat him. Yes, Stipe had been off for a long time from fighting, but Stipe still looked like he was in good shape. Still obviously had his fighting instincts. And John Jones pretty much dominated the fight from start to finish. He did a great job of getting out of the way of Stipe's power, controlling the pace of the fight at all times, especially when it came to range. He knew when to stand at his extended range and use his kicks, and when he needed to step in and smother a little bit and threaten Stipe for a takedown. He did get some takedowns also, and when he got him taken down, he did a lot of damage. So from start to finish, John Jones showed just how dominant he can be. I was kind of worried that he was going to say he was going to retire afterwards, because I know previously he had said he didn't really have much interest in fighting Tom Aspinall, but he did suggest that he wasn't ready to retire yet. And I know Dana White had been pretty much steadfast on the next heavyweight fight being Tom Aspinall, since Tom Aspinall is currently the interim heavyweight champion. So they got to make that fight happen. Hopefully, John Jones does take the fight. I think he can get rid of Tom Aspinall the same way he did Stipe. And then they can make the mega fight between him and Pereira, which would be absolutely amazing. Pereira's a big light heavyweight, which is crazy considering that he came into the UFC below light heavyweight at 185 and won the title there before losing it to Israel Adesanya. But once he's moved up to light heavyweight, he's been undefeated, and they're saying he could easily make heavyweight too. So hopefully we eventually get to that. But before that, we obviously are going to have to see Tom Aspinall and John Jones fight. So I'm hoping they can make that fight happen maybe like February of next year. That'd be a good time in my opinion. And then it would set up for a nice summertime huge blowout fight between John Jones and Pereira come summer. Now there's a couple other fights that I wanted to talk about that were also on this UFC 309 card. Obviously we got to talk about the co-main event, which was Charles Oliveira and Michael Chandler. This was actually the second time they fought, and this fight came out the same way as the first one, with Oliveira winning. Oliveira did dominate from start to finish, but in typical Chandler fashion, he never gave up. He kept going forward, and even, in my opinion, was able to win the fifth round. He showed just true resilience, fighting through submission attempts, fighting through clean punches. Oliveira is one of the best well-rounded fighters there is in the UFC as a whole. and he was able to showcase his great control of distance and pinpoint striking, great control of the hips and the takedowns and submission attempts and stuff like that. So great performance for Oliveira. Definitely set himself back up for a title rematch. And even though Chandler lost fairly decisively, I think he definitely kept himself as a fan favorite, and it'll make it easier for him to book other fights. He obviously called out Conor McGregor at the end of the fight because that was the fight he had been waiting on for a couple years that had got turned on and off, and McGregor still hasn't been able to make the fight. I don't know if he's ever going to fight again, but I get why Chandler would want to fight him. I do think Chandler would beat Conor, but if you have a chance to fight the cash cow that is Conor McGregor, obviously you want to do it. So we'll see if that ends up happening. At this point, I'm not really counting on it. The other fight that I wanted to make note of, though, from UFC 309 was between Bo Nickel and Paul Craig. Now, Paul Craig is a submission specialist. Bo Nickel is a wrestling specialist that has worked on his stand-up. He actually was a collegiate wrestler before joining in the UFC. One of the greatest collegiate wrestlers ever, actually. And his success in wrestling was his initial translation into the UFC, but since being in the UFC, he's worked on his stand-up. This fight was important because he knew that he couldn't rely on just his wrestling ability to take Craig down. Paul Craig has submitted so many other top-tier fighters that he knew that if he just took him down, he could find himself in a tough position. And Bo Nickel fought the entire fight standing, and he did a great job. I think he won every round. He had clean, effective punches. He was able to control distance, which, as I mentioned in the other two fights, is a huge key to success in any fight, is understanding the control of distance depending on your fighting style. So if you're someone who likes to kick, you might want to be further out. If you're someone who likes to grapple, you want to be further in. And that control of the space between each fighter is crucial to not only landing your shots that you want to land, but also avoiding the shots of the other fighter. And in each of these three fights that I mentioned, the winner of the fight did an excellent job at controlling distance. But I think this fight, like I said, was so important for Bo Nickel to showcase that he can actually win a fight against a tough competitor without using any of his wrestling background. So for him to be able to get the win solely using stand-up shows that he's definitely put some more effort into his overall fighting skill and becoming a well-rounded fighter, and definitely scaring some other people that he's going to fight later on as he try to make his way up to a title offense. All right, so now after that, we got to get into my recap of my picks from NFL week number 11. So those that are new to the channel, every week before Sunday's games, I give 5 game picks, 3 that are part of my pick 3, 1 that is a lock of the week, and then 1 that is my underdog pick of the week. So of course, we got to start with my pick 3. Now in this week's pick 3, I did go 3-0. I said I was going to get back on track. I mean, last week was 2-1, so it wasn't bad, but got them all right this week, 3-0 this week. This brings me to a total of 21-9 as a part of my pick 3 series. So definitely great. Hopefully we can keep this thing rolling, more 3-0s to extend that winning percentage and make it higher and higher. We get into each game individually. The first game I picked as a part of my pick 3 was the Los Angeles Rams beating the New England Patriots. The Rams were favored by 4.5 points. They did win 28-22, so they won by 6 and did cover the spread. Now this game was back and forth. I've mentioned it before, but New England has definitely shown that they've gotten better. Drake May has definitely shown that he's one of the best rookie quarterbacks that is playing this year. To me, I'd actually say that he's second best, even though Bo Nix has had more success than him. I think that if you swap the two, Drake May would have the same success with Denver and actually be better, whereas Bo Nix on New England, they'd be worse. So, in my opinion, I think Drake May has played the second best as far as the rookie starting quarterbacks. But nonetheless, yes, New England has gotten better, but the Rams were still able to pull off the win. Once again, Matt Stafford, showing his experience, was able to navigate through a tough New England defense, tough-minded team with a defensive head coach who is used to getting his team ready. If you notice, ever since New England was in England, and Coach Mayo came out and made the comments about his team being soft. They've played tough in every single game. So obviously he knew what he needed to do in order to reach his players and get more out of them, and they've definitely done that. As for the Rams, it was a timely win for them. Their division is tightly contested, and there's been a lot of change the last couple of weeks in terms of teams that were expected to win ended up losing, like the 49ers did this week, and teams that people thought were going to lose end up winning, like the Arizona Cardinals. So in order for them to stay in the hunt for the top of that division, they got to keep winning, and they were able to do that, which was my first pick, a part of my pick 3. The next game in my pick 3 was the Minnesota Vikings to beat the Tennessee Titans. The Minnesota Vikings were favored to win by 6 points, and they did win 23-13, so they won by 10, covering the spread. Now, Minnesota has definitely continued to get things back on track since they had that 2-game losing streak against Detroit and the Rams. Their defense has continued to be dominant pretty much all season. Like I've said, the biggest thing is that they fly around. They're very aggressive. They're very disruptive. And considering the way that Tennessee's offense has been hit or miss pretty much all season, it was a perfect matchup for them. Tennessee did, give some fight. They hung in there for a good amount, but Minnesota was just too much and was able to pull away with the 10-point win. And I think it's definitely got them more confidence rolling in as the rest of the season continues. Now, the last game in my pick 3 was Green Bay to beat the Chicago Bears. Now, the Green Bay Packers were favored to win by 5 points. They did not cover the spread, but it's okay. We just predicted them to win, and they did. They won the game 20-19. Now, this game came down to literally the very last play of the game. Chicago actually looked a lot better than I expected, especially considering the change with them firing their offensive coordinator, and their offense hadn't scored a touchdown in 2 weeks. The last 2 weeks before this game, they hadn't scored a touchdown at all. So they definitely did score an offensive touchdown this week and were in position to win the game, down 1 point. They were lined up for a field goal, and just like the previous week, game-winning field goal, it got blocked. So Green Bay was able to hold on to the win. Definitely an exciting game. Definitely a letdown for Chicago Bears fans. But, all in all, they don't really have the type of team that's really ready to perform in the playoffs. And I always say there's nothing worse in any sport than being right in the middle. So if you're not in contention to actually win the Super Bowl, you're better off being at the bottom so you have an easier chance of creating change and becoming one of those teams that can contend for the Super Bowl. So once again, the Packers got the win, beating up on their rival. The Packers essentially own the Bears. I can't even recall the last time the Bears actually beat the Packers in any game. And so even though this one came down to the end, they were able to get the job done. Jordan Love wasn't as clean as, people would have liked him to be, but he was able to get the job done. And at the end of the day, as long as you get the win, nothing else really matters. He did have a good drive at the end of the game that put them up. So, yes, Chicago was able to drive back and put themselves in position to score, but they didn't score, so that's all that counts. So that was the third game in my pick 3, which made me 3-0 this week. Now, the next game was my lock of the week. This lock of the week was probably the easiest lock of the week of all season. I had the Detroit Lions beating the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, this spread on this game was the largest spread of the season. They were favored to win by 14 points, and they obliterated the spread. They won 52-6, so that is a 46-point margin of victory. That's nuts. That means they won by more than 3 times the amount of the projected spread, which, like I said, was the highest spread all season. Complete dominance. As I mentioned in my pick before the game, I just feel like it's a bad matchup. Detroit had shown themselves to be the most complete team in the league. They continue to show that, beating down a team who's at the bottom. And this is one of those things that's always said is a great sign of teams. When you can beat a team that you know is not in your league and beat them convincingly to where they don't even gain confidence to think, oh, maybe we can play with you, then you know you're definitely on the right track. And Detroit has that type of mentality. They don't relax once they get up. They keep applying pressure. They keep putting their foot on their necks. And you need to do that in order to be a dominant team, in order to be a true title contender. You got to beat down the little kids when you get a chance to play the little kids. And that way, when you play better competition, everybody knows there's a different level that you can get to. So Detroit continues to be dominant, and they were able to pull off the win. So I was right this week in my lock of the week. This actually brought me to 7-3 in my lock of the week picks so far this season. So definitely a good trend. As I mentioned last week, I haven't lost one since week 4. So currently on a 6-week win streak on my lock of the week, and looking forward to it continuing in the following weeks. Now, lastly was my underdog pick of the week. The underdog pick of the week was the Indianapolis Colts to beat the New York Jets, and I was right about that one also. So that's right. I was right in my underdog pick of the week. Brought me to 3-7 on my underdog pick of the week for the year. Obviously, these ones are always going to be the hardest because my underdog pick of the week has to be a team that's favored to lose by more than 3 points and actually gets the win. If you notice, all of my picks this week, I got them right. So that's 5-0 this week in my picks. So perfect. You're welcome. But yeah, the Colts were able to pull off the win against the Jets. They won 28-27. Sucks for the Jets. You know, they made all of these changes mid-season. People were expecting them to kind of get it going. People were saying, oh, their schedule is kind of light going forward. Yet they've just continued to lose. So clearly they're the ones that people are now looking at as like, oh, this is an easy game on our schedule. Clearly their season is over in terms of having a chance at making the playoffs. Technically they're not mathematically eliminated, but I don't think anybody has any delusion anymore that this team is actually going to be good enough to not only make the playoffs, but actually do something in the playoffs. Now, granted, I was one of the people before the season that expected them to make the playoffs. I actually expected them to win their division. Clearly, I was wrong. All of the hype that we saw last year, thinking that they were just a quarterback away from being a top-tier team, was false. And, well, maybe it was false. We don't know. Because what we've seen from Aaron Rodgers is just that he's not been the difference maker that was expected. And so they've been losing. Now, on the flip side of this, the Colts, like I had mentioned before the game, Anthony Richardson was thrown back into the starting spot. And he looked like the Anthony Richardson that the Colts have been hoping for since they drafted him. He showed his ability to not only run the ball effectively, but actually throw the ball effectively too. One of his biggest things has been his accuracy. Even in college, I believe his completion percentage was around 54%. And in the NFL, it hasn't been much better than that. But in this game, I believe he was 66% in his completion percentage, which if you can get a guy like Anthony Richardson to complete over 60% of his passes consistently, you'll take that any day. So I don't know if this is going to continue. I don't know how much of that was a part of the Jets defense just not being as good as we expected, or Anthony Richardson actually learning from the 2 games that he sat and watched Joe Flacco. Either way, as long as they keep having the same type of outcome, the Colts will take it and be ecstatic on the trajectory of what to expect from Anthony Richardson going forward. We'll see going into next week if this continues or if this is just a blip on the radar. All right, so now to finish off the episode, of course, we got to get into my top 5 and worst 5 NFL rankings after week number 11. So to start at number 1, we got to go with the Detroit Lions. Now that every single team has at least lost one game, they have pretty much shown that they had the most complete team all season. So to get into this number one spot that they deserve, they only have that one loss. And every time, like I mentioned earlier, that they play a team that's beneath them, they show that there's huge levels between the bottom and the top, and they destroy them. That's exactly what they did this week against Jacksonville. So they deserve to be in this number one spot. And based on how they're playing, I don't know if they're ever going to leave this spot, but we'll see. Coming in at number 2, I got to go with the Buffalo Bills. Now, I've been super critical of the Bills all year, mainly because I felt like they haven't beaten a good team, not even like a playoff team or fringe playoff team all year. Now, part of that has kind of changed because the Cardinals look to be better than I expected them to be, and they might actually make the playoffs. So that would have been a playoff team that they've beaten. But other than the Cardinals, the other two teams that they played that were considered good were the Ravens and the Texans, and those are their two losses. So I hadn't put the Bills in my top 5 because I felt like they hadn't really earned it. Well, this week they definitely earned it. They were able to have Kansas City, who was previously undefeated, come into Buffalo, and they were able to get the win. Not only did they win, but they covered the spread. Josh Allen played phenomenal and showed why he is probably now number 1 in the MVP race, and deservingly so. So they deserve to, like I said, they got their quality win. They deserve to move up, and they are now in the number 2 spot. Coming in at number 3, I got to go with the Kansas City Chiefs. Yes, they did have their first loss of the season, but again, they've only got one loss on the season. There's only one other team who only has one loss on the season, and that's the Detroit Lions. And it wasn't like they lost to a terrible team or a mediocre team. It is the team that is now ranked above them at number 2. So they deserve to not fall any further than this spot, and that's why I have them at 3. This is the first game that the defense gave up 30 points since week 4 of 2 seasons ago. So on one hand, you could say, well, it's a great job by Buffalo for being able to do it. On another hand, you could say it's probably not going to happen again, or if it does, it's very unlikely. So they definitely still, I think, still have, if not the best, one of the best defenses in the league. And the offense actually has looked better recently. They weren't able to get the job done at the end of the game late. There were definitely some turnovers during this game against Buffalo, but I'm still not picking too many teams above them as far as being able to beat the Chiefs on a week-to-week basis. So they deserve to be in this number 3 spot. Coming in at number 4, I got to go with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Steelers got a great win this week against the Baltimore Ravens. They have pretty much owned the Ravens during Lamar Jackson's tenure. I believe Lamar is now 1-4 when playing against the Pittsburgh Steelers since he's been in the league. So Pittsburgh has a great game plan for him. They're able to keep him bottled up. Now, I think Baltimore kind of played into that game plan because, once again, which has been the trend in all of Baltimore's losses, they didn't really feed Derrick Henry enough. He averaged 5 yards per carry, but they only gave him 13 carries, which doesn't make any sense to me. Part of the reason why I said that Derrick Henry was a bigger MVP favorite than Lamar Jackson is because his level of carries has directly correlated to the Baltimore Ravens winning or losing. Once again, the same thing occurred, and they lost. But more about Pittsburgh. Their defense has been elite essentially every year, every game. But now with Russell Wilson at quarterback, they have more of a steady presence at quarterback than what they've had previously. I thought it was interesting they did put in Justin Fields at the end of the game to secure it with a quarterback run and then a fake quarterback run on the very last play, which I'm assuming to some degree had to feel good for him, even though he messed up on his quarterback run and slid too soon. Nonetheless, with them being able to effectively find themselves in scoring position with their offense, their defense is seemingly always going to be top tier. They deserve to be in this number 4 spot. And coming in at number 5, I got to stay with the Minnesota Vikings. Again, the Minnesota Vikings have had impressive wins throughout the season, beating other top tier teams. Their defense, like I said, is one of the best, and their offense still has explosive players all over, great receivers and running back, and their quarterback hasn't messed it up. So they deserve to stay in the top 5 this week, and they are at number 5. Now for the worst 5, we got to go to 28. That is the Cleveland Browns. Now the Browns, a couple weeks ago, well now a few weeks ago, beat the Baltimore Ravens when they finally had Jameis Winston starting. It seemed like maybe they were going to have some momentum to be able to, I don't know, maybe try to fight for a fringe last playoff position. But ever since then, they've lost 2 straight, and they've looked worse and worse in each consecutive week. I don't know what's going on. Nick Chubb has come back from injury. He looks like he just not the same Nick Chubb yet. Now, part of that could just be him warming up. Part of that could be that the defense doesn't fear anybody on that team, so they can stack the box. I don't know yet. But nonetheless, Cleveland desperately looks like they're falling back to the way they looked when they had Deshaun Watson as their starting quarterback, and not looking good for the outcome for the rest of the season. Now, coming in at number 29, I got to go with the New York Giants. The Giants were on a bye this week. They did announce yesterday, actually no, they announced it this morning, that the Giants are going to be benching Daniel Jones as a starting quarterback and going with Danny DeVito. Do I think that's going to make much of a difference? No. But at this point, I think it's just encouraging for them to finally figure out that Daniel Jones is not the guy. I feel like they should have known this before. I feel like they got tricked by the last 6 to 7 games in Dayball's first year as coach. He played okay, and they were able to get wins, so they thought, oh yeah, this is the guy. It's not the guy. And he had a larger sample size of not being the guy than being a decent guy, yet they still went ahead and paid him. Now they're paying the price for it. Now it looks like they're moving on. Not a good outlook for the team as a whole, but at least they can get some looks for the other quarterback, see what else they have in store. Now at number 30, we got to go with the Jacksonville Jaguars. As I mentioned in talking about the Detroit Lions, the Jacksonville Jaguars got destroyed. Mac Jones was in the game. Didn't really look any different from what we saw earlier in the year with Trevor Lawrence. It's pretty much what you would expect from Mac Jones. The reason why he's no longer in New England. Like, he has some talent, but he's not a needle mover, especially not when he has tough competition like the Detroit Lions. Too many turnovers, not enough effective movement of the ball. Jacksonville looks like they're going to be planning for another top 1 or top 2 pick or so. So we'll see what they do with it in this upcoming draft. But right now, they definitely deserve to be in this bottom 5. At 31, I got to go with the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders lost this week to the Miami Dolphins. And even though early in the game they kept it close for a little bit, it eventually got stretched out to where they looked as we expected. As I said in the last previous weeks, there's nothing exciting about the Raiders. I believe they're currently on like a 6-game losing streak. I don't see it getting better anytime soon. I'm pretty sure they're going to get up again when they get to play the Chiefs just because it's their most hated division rival. And I feel like that's the game that they put the most effort in. So that game might end up being close. But other than that, I don't really see them contending in any of the games going forward. And they're another team that's probably better off positioning itself for getting as early of a pick as they can to hopefully make a change. They desperately need a quarterback. And thankfully, there should be several quarterbacks available whenever they pick in the draft. But fortunately for them, they are not last. In last place, coming in at 32, we got to go with the Dallas Cowboys. Now, it is Monday night, so I just finished watching the game like a couple hours ago. It is what I said it was last week when I put them in last place. The team looks terrible. Cooper Rush did look better this week than he did the previous week, but that didn't really take much because he looked awful in the previous week. Granted, they were playing right now a lesser team. I'd say Philadelphia looks a little better than the Texans do, so that could be part of the reason why he looked a little more effective. But still, nonetheless, they didn't really get anything done. I believe they finished with 10 points. You're not really going to beat too many teams scoring 10 points, especially when your defense isn't great. So, yeah, there's nothing promising that I can see going forward for the rest of the season for Dallas. I guess the only positive is that they now seemingly can't get in their own way of thinking that they actually are a playoff team, thinking that they're Super Bowl contenders. All of the delusional fans that often say that the Cowboys are Super Bowl contenders every year now can come to the realization that they're just not good. And they can go towards expecting what they're going to look like for next year, what kind of changes they're going to make to the coaching staff, who they're going to pick in the draft, and how they can be back relevant again. So that's pretty much it. And that's it for this episode. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Please make sure you like and subscribe and share wherever possible. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Peace.